Welcome to Cancer and Peace. My name is Sean Stewart. I'm here with Peter Scalzo, and we're going to have another episode today because we're talking about the stages of the cancer journey. And last time we did adolescence, the age of innocence, I'll call it, even in the cancer journey, that right after diagnosis and just that early, just even shell-shocked, what does that look like? Mm-hmm. And today we're going to open another chapter in the book because I think there are 6 of them that we're going to go through before we're done. And this one's going to be the explorer stage. Mm. And so I'm going to see if Peter has enough cognitive ability.
That's questionable.
To remember his explorer stage in the cancer journey and just tell us a little bit about it, because he's going to be talking now for about 20 minutes while I listen.
No, that's not what's going to happen. But just define for us the explorer stage. What happens?
Yeah, in the explorer stage, wait a second. I was asking you to do that. How did you put it back on me?
No, I'll
yeah, it's okay. I'll give
apply it to my life.
Yeah, I'll give a little bit back. Yeah. It's you when you enter your cancer journey and you really don't know where to go yet. Yeah. It's you start looking at, like in your life, you look at all these options are out there and there's risks and I think the things that I would love to hear about are you had to do that in the treatment realm, but you also had to do that and how are you going to approach this in your spiritual journey and your emotional spiritual journey? And it's like this explorer stage is figuring out, it's the stage of learning what risks to take. And you don't have all the answers. You're trying to figure out the answers and what direction you're going to go. Mm-hmm. And as you're trying to figure out what directions you have to settle on, hey, I'm going to take this risk, this path. And that's going to open the next stage, because the next stage is what we're going to call warrior. Mm-hmm. And warrior is where you go to battle. And in this journey, you're going to be in this battle for a little while. But the explorer stage is the stage before battle where you are making a plan. You're figuring out what it means to your life, and you start looking at what risks and you know, what does it mean to your life, so to speak. And so you don't have it all figured out, and you're trying to figure that out in this period of time.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Sean. You know, and I think in my journey, I had 10 years before it became metastatic, and that's a big deal when the cancer becomes metastatic. And some people find out right at the onset that it is metastatic. But I had 10 years of cancer contained in a particular place, having surgeries to actually remove the cancer, so surgical solutions. And I remember before being diagnosed with cancer, my mom, of course, had been diagnosed with cancer a couple of years before mine. And so I was thrust into a cancer space with her, and I had a lot of fear about that space. Did not want to really settle in and deal with that fear. I really didn't. And so when I got diagnosed with cancer, I would say fear was the number one emotion that I felt. Yeah. And I still didn't want to deal with it. And so I didn't. And when I say that I didn't, what I mean by that is I understood the reality of my diagnosis. I had cancer. Yeah. I felt I didn't feel well, all that. And I had surgeries, and I had major surgery in 2005 to remove my bladder, prostate, all that. It's called a radical cystectomy, but I still, how I dealt with it was by saying, okay, this is potentially a life-threatening thing, but I put that on the shelf. I don't think this is. And my narrative was that I'm going to be fine, that when people ask me, how are you doing? It was, I'm doing fine. And I just need to get the surgery. I'll be back to work. I'll be back with my life, all that. I didn't view it as something that was going to have the potential to take my life. I mean, that was in the back of my mind, but not in the front windshield kind of thing.
That's a great answer. I was actually thinking that's it's a really good answer, and it's not, I guess, good or bad, but it's like you're describing exactly what I think we're trying to get into is you had a philosophy about how you were going to take on the journey, and you started describing that philosophy, and the philosophy was it's a medical journey that's manageable. Yeah. And if it's manageable, I'm just going to trust the system to manage that, and I'm going to do the steps.
Yeah, and just sorry to interrupt, but just to that point, I remember before being diagnosed, hearing ads from Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City, number one, number two cancer center, whatever it is, thinking to myself, even then, the thought would come in, if I ever get diagnosed with cancer, I'm going there. I just had that feeling like this place is a place of expertise, healing. And then when I was diagnosed with cancer, I was treated locally. And the local treatment was not going well on this. The surgery that I had and what they wanted to do. I didn't know for sure, but I had a deep question of, I don't think I'm being thorough enough with this, and I think I need to get a second opinion. And immediately what came to my mind was Memorial Sloan Kettering. I kind of made up my mind pretty early. I'm going to go down there to get a second opinion.
So it's good. There's categories inside this explorer stage,
Yes.
and one is the exploring medical options, and we've talked a lot on this podcast about getting to a place of solidity. Like you're not here to give medical advice in any way. But coming to a point in your treatment where you make a decision to go a certain way and you run with that, and then not second guessing or not, there's no silver bullets, but also figuring out what that path is. And so you're describing a bit in that space. And I want to turn now for a second to something about the way you said that first interaction was, there was a bit of denial of the life-threatening of this. This almost, and so I'm going to ask, when did it become a spiritual journey, so to speak, in a confrontational, where it's confronted who you were as when did that happen in a big way for you? Because it sounded like at first you kind of said, well, I just kind of said, yes, you, in the back of your mind, you knew that cancer is always life-threatening, but you kind of ignored it and said, hey, I'm going to do the treatment, and it's a physical journey, and I'm going to approach it as a physical journey and go through the steps. When did it become really a spiritual journey?
And you probably already know the answer to that one, but so I was in my 14th surgery 10 years later at Lenox Hill Hospital. Sloan couldn't do these intricate surgeries anymore, so they sent me to a specialist at Lenox Hill down on Park Avenue in Manhattan. And that surgery, waking up, changed my narrative, changed my life, changed my outlook, changed everything.
That's fascinating. And so the explorer stage is really that point where you're trying to discover. You're discovering who you are and what risks to take, and you also find out that the world isn't perfect. There's real life and death and real risk, and so it's as if up front you were basically still trying to live in this packaged perfect world, and at some point in time that got shaken loose in the process of your journey. So describe a little bit as far as now when you think about risk-taking and the spiritual journey, like how would you approach the explorer stage, knowing now what you know? And just thinking about, if you're here and I think you're in the sage mode of your cancer journey, and what's a great way to approach this stage of explorer in both the physical and the spiritual realms, as you think about now the importance of this stage?
Yeah, I think just in the physical realm, I'll deal with that first. And, I've been helping lead a cancer support group, actually the main ministry leader for like 18, 19 years now. And I get questioned a lot that, hey, I just got this diagnosis. What do you think? And I think for me, it's to listen to the particulars of what the diagnosis is. And I am obviously not a doctor, so I know where my limits are. But to encourage individuals to get an opinion by a major cancer center, because, just practically speaking, there are hospitals that have cancer units in them. But there are institutions that focus totally on cancer, major cancer centers. So they have the research, state of the art, they have the up-to-date treatments, everything. And where we live in close proximity to probably the top 5 cancer centers, some of them in the world. We have Dana-Farber we have places in Boston. We have Sloan Kettering in New York City. We have Yale. We have a lot of really good cancer centers around us. So the exploring stage I encourage people to have someone come alongside of them in this stage on the physical level, that when they go to doctor's visits, have someone go with you taking notes, because there is the shock, and the grieving process usually begins right away, trying to accept the reality of what's going on. And a lot of times in this explorer stage, physically, we can miss things. So it's really good to bring somebody along. Plus, I'll speak for myself, I tended to have like a bias, let's say. And it was great to have someone there who would say, hey, let's question this part of it. Let's question the other part, That's
such great feedback, because you're really speaking of part of the explorer stage is to move out of ignorance and also recognize that you have biases. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to say, and that treatment facilities have biases. Mm-hmm. And by getting a second opinion and by going into a place that looks broader, it'll help you really deal with those biases. And I'm going to guess a big thing, even if you end up being treated locally, you're going to have much less likelihood of second guessing yourself.
Yeah. So it's a pathway to peace in the physical journey.
Yeah.
Because you've exhausted options. And, I'm not going to say the instances, but I do know several people that if they had gone to the major cancer center, they wouldn't have passed at the time that they did, because there were options and things that the major cancer center had. But I don't use fear as a motivator to go to a major cancer center. I just say, hey, why don't you just get a second opinion and find out what's going on out there? Because these folks are at the cutting edge of research. They run the clinical trials. So they have all the data in front of them. Like, for instance, the surgery that I needed, my local hospital did 1 a year, right? And my surgeon alone at Sloan Kettering did like 100 a year. And it's a whole practice that does more of them. So they're just equipped and they know what to do. And the facilities were like a whole nother generation above what I was used to. I mean, it was just, and there's comfort in that. There's peace in that, knowing that you really have the best eyes looking at your physical case.
Can I put a thought out here too to see how you react to it? Is I wasn't actually thinking about this when we started the podcast, but our biases, and there's a lot of different thoughts about cancer, and you see everything from homeopathic to homemade remedies to. You're talking about you have a bias, and that's okay. I think it's fine to have a bias about making sure to get information from. Look at the major cancer centers that are doing major research, that have resources I think that's a good thing. And I think what I'm hearing from this, but I'm curious about is it's really taking time in this explorer stage to not allow your biases to be your only option, to really take time to listen and learn and assume that maybe you don't know is a way to approach this stage. And then you can still choose something that is not what you would choose in the end, but use this time, I think, is what I'm hearing you say. And tell me if I'm, even if you want to explore things that are very non-traditional, this is the stage to do that.
Yeah. And some people go back to the explorer stage when the treatment they're doing doesn't work. So they'll go back into that stage. But yes, I mean, to consider all options. And that's why when I give my advice, I really specifically say this is how I view it.
Yeah.
And I've known people that have had good results from traditional medical or alternative approaches. And I know people who have passed from both too. So I think it's an individualized decision.
Let me throw a wrench into the works here. Faith healing.
Yeah. Well, I think if you rely totally on faith healing, I don't know many. I'm sure there are people that have done that totally on faith healing, but usually they'll try anything, even if it's a different supplement or different diet or that kind of thing, along with faith healing. So I'm sure there are people who have not done anything medically, whether alternative or traditional, and just rely totally on faith healing. My experience personally with faith healing is not that great. I'll just be honest about that. I've been to very well-known faith healers, and they've said certain things about my case. I'm not talking about local. I'm talking about like national figures, which didn't pan out. It didn't. It wasn't what happened. Was in fact the opposite of what they said would happen. So now, does that negate God's power to heal? No. I mean, I've told my story of a miraculous healing where the surgeon is like, the tumor's gone.
This is of God, not my work. Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's a good. I raise it because I think. Let's be willing to explore. Let's be willing to talk about all the areas. And I think what I'm hearing you say as your advice, at least, is don't be one-dimensional.
Yeah.
And don't come in with just, this is the way. Come in and be willing to use the explorer stage. This is an important part of the journey, is to be an explorer.
Just to your point, too, in the faith realm, I was very open. I mean, I had churches anointing me with oil going up front.
Yeah.
The elder board at my church had an all-night prayer vigil for me, anointing. And so whenever anyone said, Peter, can I pray for you? The answer was almost always yes. I welcome those prayers.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want to be the skeptic that wouldn't invite any pathway that God wanted to use. I'm just saying, for me, that was not. I can't point to that and say, "Oh, the faith healer said X, and then X happened."
Right.
Yeah, that's all. And now, so that's the physical piece, right?
Yep.
So the emotional, and I'm going to link in the spiritual one. That's a whole nother matter as far as this stage goes. I think it depends on how much your world is being rocked. Like, what kind of diagnosis is it? There's some diagnoses that the doctors basically say, "Oh, we're just going to take an estrogen pill, and this is so slow growing, it's not going to be that much of an interruption in your life, right?" Then there's other cases where I was just given six weeks to live. But I do think with any diagnosis, there's that identity question. Okay, all of a sudden now for me, I was a father, I was a husband, I was an attorney, I was a Christian leader in my church. Now I'm a cancer patient. So I added that to the list of things, identity-wise. And but I mean, when I was explorer / going into probably the next phase, which we're going to talk about in the next podcast. But when I had that 14th surgery 10 years into it, when, just to refresh the listeners, it's waking up in ICU after 10 hours of 3 surgeons who did brand new stuff on me, and knowing that I had a 5% survival chance. That's a total rip the foundations of my emotions and spiritual world and just take it apart. How do I navigate this thing?
Yeah, I think the reason why I wanted to make sure you tie in the spiritual side on the explorer side is you and I have a mutual friend who just had a scare about his heart, potential. And immediately when it comes to cancer or a heart issue, mortality becomes front and center in your mind, at least for a window. And it's, you and I talk about the wall all the time. And it's like, to be brought to the wall is to be brought to an opportunity to face yourself, the deepest part of you. And the reason why I like this stage called Explorer Stage is that most people haven't done an exploration journey on themselves of who they really are, and what they've either been avoiding, or the depths of who they are in such a way. And we call it the inner journey. We talk about the inner journey on a regular basis. Recovery journey is an inner journey. And so, I think the Explorer Stage, when you have a wall a moment, because a cancer diagnosis is a wall, it may not be the wall. Like, I think you have incidences in your journey that are part of it, that are like the big walls that did cause great transformation in your inner person of who you are. But this Explorer Stage, I think you're being invited to explore the wall, because you had to at least recognize your mortality, even if it isn't as threatened as strongly, depending on the diagnosis, but you had to recognize it.
Yeah.
There's something inside of you. It's like, I'm mortal. And there's that, this is scary.
Right. Yeah. And I had very radical surgery in the beginning, removing stuff. I mean, and it's for someone who has high grade, potentially, metastatic bladder cancer, they'll remove the bladder, prostate, and create a new one out of intestinal tissue. So it's not that rare, but it's high grade bladder cancer is not that common of a cancer. So I had that piece of it. I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
Well, I think you were just going into what that you had initial stage. It wasn't as life threatening. And
yeah.
You went
So I had these, like, on the timeline. I remember after I was in the hospital for a month and then 6 weeks but I remember at one point running. I was a very athletic guy. I lifted weights and I ran 4 miles almost every day, but I had to suspend all that. And I remember at one point running again after this surgery, thinking to myself, life is back to normal. This is wonderful. And then, still being checked. And of course, all my scans and checks and procedures, and then having another scare with a major surgery again, but things returning back to normal. A lot of surgeries and procedures in there, but never metastatic cancer. And so, yes, radical surgeries that changed my body, all that. But when the metastatic, life-threatening mortality one, because as they say in Wizard of Oz, that's a horse of a different color. That's a different issue to deal with. Yeah. And especially in 2017, they told me to call hospice. It was throughout, and I got treatment, and the treatment worked miraculously, really. And that was God working, because they said the treatment shouldn't have been that effective. But even that, I still get checked all the time, procedures all the time. I have a procedure next week, surgical procedure. So I have to deal with the prospect of death and dying, just about, it's in the back of my mind. I think I never felt like that before, like, going about my work. I was an attorney, 6 kids, all that, strong, athletic, and leading stuff, and never thought about passing.
I think you're getting ready to speak about the warrior stage, so I want to hold that a bit for the next podcast. Okay. But I think you've brought us up to that point, and that's important, because the explorer stage, you might be able to ignore, because you talked about, at first you were able to push it back and just move on, and you even I'm going to go back to running and acting like life is normal. And the warrior stage, you're forced to step outside of that and say, if I don't fight this battle, I may not be here. It means something bigger.
Yeah, I think
So I want to cover that in the next podcast. But
and so on the emotional side of things, so I still had fear, like I really was scared of any kind of a scan or threats of cancer coming back, all that. But it wasn't so front and center as it was 10 years later, where in that warrior stage. Yeah, it wasn't. And so I was dealing with it, but not really. I kind of put it on a shelf, and I didn't really process it.
Yeah.
Right. I kind of just said, fear is my main issue. So I'm scared, but hey, life is back to normal. I'm good. I'm going to keep working. I'm going to be working. This is not going to take my life. All right. I don't have to think about that piece.
You came up with a strategy to move forward in both your physical and spiritual, emotional side of your life.
Yep.
And you started living that.
Yep.
And that's the explorer stage. You learn how to navigate with a scare of mortality. And I think the next stage is going to be interesting to talk about. But I hope people get an idea a little bit that, hey, there's this age of innocence, the shock. You talked about shock. That's the adolescence, this early. You've been reduced and your world is rocked. But you're kind of, you have to get your bearings. And then the explorer stage is, letting that shock wear off. You're getting a level of understanding of what's going on. Then you set a course, you make decisions both in your journey, you explore options, and you set a course. And we're going to talk about the warrior stage in the next podcast. So I'm kind of excited about it.
Yeah. And I think I'll just say this, that I not only had the cancer wall, but I had the wall of a marriage crisis, a marriage that was ending. It was really breaking down. It was very broken.
Yeah.
At the same time. And then we had the wall of, Leslie and I did, of our oldest daughter going through a drug addiction journey, which was horrific.
Well, you're highlighting something I think that I wanted to highlight off of this as the explorer stage, is that you were being invited into something. And it didn't, like, you think about those things, you don't think about it that way necessarily, but you were being invited into the greatest journey of your life. And it's going to be the most difficult, but the explorer stage, if you've been diagnosed, you recognize that something's changed in your life. Part of, I think, even taking time to recognize that you're in explorer stage is to recognize you're being invited into a journey that looks different than what your life has looked like to this point. And you talk about identity change, but your emotional, spiritual self is being invited to change. And I think a big part of that change, and you talked about those 3 big walls, you were being invited to look deeply into who God had actually called you to be, and to face yourself and to surrender that. And that's the explorer stage, is an invitation into another stage in life. And that's at the wall. And that's a pretty big stage. It's an important stage. It's a transitional stage.
Yes. And it's like, okay, there's this wall in front of me. What am I going to do? And we've talked about that on podcasts.
The difference between certain types of walls is some walls you can bounce off.
Right.
And you could have bounced off. Maybe, let's say your cancer had been treatable and it never showed up again for the next 10 years, then would it had any impact on your life in any meaningful way? It might just be a blip. And that could be a form of bouncing off the wall because you weren't forced to face yourself. Your cancer brought you to a wall that you had to face. And you could choose to face yourself and this cancer and your mortality and what it meant. And you chose to. And it's a big invitation. It's a hard invitation, but man, we're sitting here talking, and I'm hearing a man who's become a sage on the backside of this. And it's a pretty cool thing to recognize what that journey has done for you, done to you, in you, and what God's done in that. So let's explore. I think we'll stop there for today, unless you have anything else you want to put into the marketplace here of thought.
I don't.
All right, good. That makes it easy. So thanks everyone for listening. We'll continue these stages in the next podcast. Blessings.